India buys more than 85% of the crude oil it consumes. And right now, those barrels are getting significantly more expensive. Brent is trading above $90 a barrel, but tightening physical supplies mean Indian refiners are effectively paying nearly $10 above Brent for some Gulf crude. Russian oil, which cushioned India with hefty discounts after the Ukraine war, is not providing much relief either. Meanwhile, disruption in West Asia has taken millions of barrels of Gulf supply off the market, forcing India to source crude from farther away. So, how vulnerable is India to this new oil shock, and who eventually pays the bill? I talked to Prashant Vashisht, Senior VP and Co-Group Head at ICRA in this episode. It's Friday, the 21st of August. I'm Anirban Chaudhary. This is the Morning Brief. Hi, Mr. Vashisht. Welcome to the Morning Brief podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Right. Let's start with, what's happening with crude, with Brent crude, and what is the impact? It seems that Indian refiners are effectively paying nearly $10 above Brent for Gulf crude right now. Why is this happening?
Brent is a benchmark. Global crude oil prices are at a premium or a discount to this, depending on the quality of the crude, one. And two, there can be dislocations like we are seeing right now to the crude prices, or these premium or discounts can go up or down depending on availability issues and disruptions. So currently what we are seeing is the benchmark is lower, but the prices of crude actually are available are higher. Now, if you recall, a few months back after the hostilities started in West Asia, Oman crude was priced at roughly about $140 plus, whereas the benchmark Brent was still showing $92. Now, that was because the premiums had increased drastically simply because of the supply disruptions. And the benchmark was probably lower because of some IEA stocks that were being liquidated, but actual crude price available on a physical delivery basis was priced much higher. So that is the kind of scenario that we've been seeing now since the start of the hostilities in West Asia.
All right. What about Russian crude and the discounts on them? I mean, those were kind of a big advantage for our refiners. I mean, they cushioned India for years now. Why have they almost disappeared?
So the supply disruptions from the Middle East were about 10 to 11 million barrels. Even today, as I read IEA's article, it is about 8.3 million barrels per day of Gulf output that is still shut in. Now, considering the scenario of about 100 million barrels per day of global demand, 10 million barrels per day of crude being, supply not coming through is, a very large quantity that is, disrupted. See, the Russian supplies, when they started in 2022, after the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, when we started getting the discounts, they were initially very high at double-digit dollars per barrel. But then just prior to November or October, 22 large companies of Russia were sanctioned. The discounts had narrowed down considerably to about $2 to $3 per barrel. Now, that is because of greater acceptance and other countries also, buying Russian oil. So there were more takers for Russian oil. Once the Gulf War or this Iran-US conflict broke out, the supplies through the Strait of Hormuz were disrupted. And accordingly, as I mentioned, about 10 million barrels per day of crude was shut in. And that all happened, fairly fast. So in a scenario, so much supply has been shut in and disrupted, the discounts on Russian crude were bound to immediately disappear. Because now it was a seller's market, crude prices were going through the roof, above 90, above 100. And so on. With supplies being so low, the discounts on Russian crude sort of disappeared.
Understood. How much of this premium that Indian refiners are facing is the war, and how much is an actual shortage of available barrels?
See, globally, crude prices will be determined by supply and demand dynamics. Only thing here is that the distances from where we are getting crude now are also increased. Just to give you a sense, for India to import crude from the Middle East, it takes about 40 to 70 cents per barrel. If the same crude is to come from, say, United States or the Americas, it is about $2.50 to $4 per barrel. So that itself is leading to higher costs because more and more crude is being procured from farther off places. Also, Russian crude accounted for about 46% of the crude that India imported in June and about 41% in the previous month, May. That is the latest data that we have from CMIE. How much is the price sort of dislocation because of quality premium or premium, and otherwise how much is it because of supply disruptions? So going back to my first answer, once the supply was disrupted and crude supply came into shortage, the premiums have been going, through the roof. It will be very difficult for me to separate the two, but that's the phenomena that we've been witnessing since the time the geopolitical situation happened.
All right. Explain the economics to me. At what point does expensive crude really start squeezing Indian refiners' margins?
So there are two things to this. One is the refinery margins, which are called the GRMs, gross refining margins, and the other is the marketing margins, right? So roughly between 85 to 90, a refiner come marketer would break even given the increase in prices as well as the reduction, the excise duty cuts that the government has made in the past few months. So that is one. Now, coming to both of these separately, the gross refining margins are very, very high right now. That is because diesel is in short supply. Diesel is in short supply again because there have been a lot of attacks on Russian refining facilities, which has led to Russia banning the exports of diesel. Now, this has led to India exporting even to as far as, Brazil, other countries. And the crack spreads for diesel are very, very strong right now, 50, 60, 70, those kinds. Whereas if you look at the past 10-year average, these would be about $16. So clearly, some of the margins are extraordinarily high right now. Now, what this does is that this would obviously lead to very high gross refining margins or GRMs for the refiners. So what the government has done is that they have worked out a formula of capping the gross refining margins of the standalone refiners so that the marketing losses on the sales of auto fuels doesn't go out of hand or are not very, very high. The marketing margins would, again, as I mentioned, would be about break even at somewhere between crude prices of 85 to 90. Beyond this, if crude prices rise significantly, then the marketing margins on auto fuels become negative. And that is why we saw 1,000 crore losses that the OMCs were reporting at one point in time a few months back.
And if these prices persist, then ultimately, I mean, of course, the refiners bear some of the brunt, but what about the government and consumers?
Yeah, so certainly, see, there have been some increases in prices that have happened in the past few months and excise duty cuts. The other point is also the very large losses that we were making on LPG also. Now, at one point in time, these were about 670, 680 rupees per cylinder. Obviously, prices have come down since then. What we see historically is that the auto fuel prices have not gone up very significantly, or a number of times, rather, very, very frequent changes have not happened. Rather, when the prices started going up now, just a few months back, that was a price change after 4 years. So I think it's an evolving situation, and the government and the OMCs would look at this for some sustained price signals before they actually decide for price increases, etc.
Got it. So are there other options open to India? For example, can it simply replace expensive Gulf barrels with more crude from, say, the US, Brazil, or Guyana?
So we are already doing that. Russia was a large supplier, so is Venezuelan crude. And US also. One thing that needs to be borne in mind is also that out of the 10 million barrels that was disrupted, about 4 million barrels per day was made up by the strategic crude oil reserves released by IEA and countries like China. So that also cushioned the impact. The price rise could have been even higher if this crude release was not there. So now, as the world sort of draws upon its reserves, as some of these countries have to come back to the market to procure, there could be further hike in crude prices. Some of these factors are also at play, leading to the dislocation in the crude prices as we see now. But India is certainly trying to make up, supplies by tapping these far-off countries as well, which were not a very large percentage of its crude basket earlier.
Do we have a percentage of the non-Gulf crude that we are importing right now?
As I mentioned, about 46% in June was from Russia. Saudi Arabia was just about 18.8 million tons. So Middle East was only about 22%, which was used to be as high as 45 to 50% prior to the conflict.
Understood. And finally, Mr. Vashisht, how do you see this panning out? I mean, apart from what's happening geopolitically, what has to change for India's crude costs to come back down? And, how quickly could that happen?
So, see, given the current very volatile geopolitical situation, India's options are very limited for bringing the crude cost down. I think the number one priority is to keep, ample stocks and keep arranging for ample supplies. There aren't many options to reduce crude prices in this scenario. So even when there were peace talks, crude prices came down to about $70, $72 very fast. And if you recall, in most of FY 2026, after April 9th, when, this tariffs and counter tariffs tussle started between US and China, and there were global economic slowdown concerns, crude dropped from about 77 as on March 31st to about 65 and stayed at 65 to 70 for most part of the year until this geopolitical situation started building up. And by building up means hostilities did not start, but there were those naval vessel movements, etc. So once the geopolitical situation in Middle East sort of resolves, we can expect a significant reduction in crude prices that we saw even in a brief time once the peace talks were looking like they were progressing well. Now, obviously, the refining companies are mostly arranging crude globally with not much in their hand, which would, reduce the crude prices. But over long term, some of the measures that the oil companies are looking at, including the upstream companies, is, greater exploration initiatives. As you know, there was this large package announced which had various components, including a subsidy for deep water drilling for a particular number of wells. There was a very large amount, I think 22,000 crore allocated for seismic data collection so as to, be better able to assess the prospectivity of some of the newly opened regions. So, but I think those kind of measures will take 3 to 5 years to start showing up, even the first oil. So as of now, I think the options are kind of limited right now.
Mr. Vashisht, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
For now, India has few easy ways to escape expensive crude. Diversifying suppliers can keep the barrels flowing, but not necessarily make them cheaper. Much depends on what happens in West Asia. Until supply normalizes, India's challenge is less about finding cheap oil and more about ensuring it can find enough oil. That's it for today. You were listening to this episode on The Morning Brief. It was produced by me, sound designed by Amrit Reggie. Keep following our podcast on your favorite listening platforms. Stay tuned.